Imagine a family whose name was tied to ships, islands, and the kind of headlines that mixed wealth with heartbreak. The Onassis story isn't just about money. It's about people living under a spotlight they could never escape. In this video, we'll move through their world, the power, the scandals, the love, and the losses that made their name unforgettable. If you enjoy it, hit like and subscribe. It really helps me make more videos like this. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments, whether it's your thoughts on the Onassis family, or just where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Origins of a dynasty. When people think of the name Onassis, they often imagine marble yachts gliding through turquoise waters, or Jackie Kennedy stepping onto the deck of Christina O in a silk scarf. Yet the story begins far from the glitter of Monaco, or the quiet wealth of New York's Fifth Avenue. It begins in Smyrna, a bustling port city on the Aegean coast, modern-day Izmir, Turkey, where East met West in a swirl of commerce, languages, and ambitions. At the turn of the 20th century, Smyrna was a cosmopolitan hub. Greek merchants, Armenian traders, Turkish officials, Levantine bankers, and European consuls all shared its streets. For a young boy named Aristotle Socrates Onassis, born in 1906, it was the perfect classroom in wealth and survival. The Onassis family was not poor. Aristotle's father, Socrates Onassis, dealt in tobacco, an industry that, at the time, was a ticket into the world of commerce. Tobacco was Smyrna's gold, a crop that traveled in barrels and crates across the Mediterranean and into the parlors of Paris and London. The young Aristotle grew up seeing the rhythms of money, ships arriving, deals struck, fortunes made and lost with each cargo. But prosperity was fragile, built on a region balancing uneasily between empires. To understand Aristotle's beginnings, think of a child raised in a house perched on the edge of a cliff. The view is magnificent. Ships, markets, a world of opportunity stretching outward. But beneath that home, the ground trembles with political fault lines. In 1922, when Greek forces retreated from Smyrna at the end of the Greco-Turkish War, tragedy struck. The city burned, tens of thousands were killed, and hundreds of thousands fled. The Onassis family, like so many others, became refugees. Aristotle's early life shifted overnight from comfort to survival. He went from the son of a respected merchant to a displaced teenager with little more than determination in his pocket. Imagine, for a moment, what it would feel like to have the foundations of your life pulled away. One day, you are sitting at a family table with silverware and servants. The next, you are huddled in a refugee camp, clutching your belongings in a bundle. It leaves a scar, but also a spark. For Aristotle, that scar became a lifelong hunger to build something so vast, so enduring, that no fire, no war, no political upheaval could ever strip it away again. The story of reinvention began in Buenos Aires. At just 17 years old, Aristotle boarded a ship bound for Argentina, carrying little money but an oversized ambition. He started as a humble telephone operator, listening to conversations he was not supposed to hear. Yet in those voices, the businessmen discussing deals, the diplomats gossiping, he found an informal education. He learned how the wealthy spoke, how they maneuvered, how they thought. Every call was a free seminar in power. To most, it was just noise on the line. To Aristotle, it was a roadmap. Buenos Aires in the 1920s was a city of promise. Argentina was rich from beef and grain, its avenues lined with European-style cafes and theaters. For an immigrant willing to work hard, doors could open. But Aristotle wanted not just to enter through those doors. He wanted to own the house. He leveraged his background in tobacco, striking deals with Greek contacts and eventually building a small business that exported cigarettes. He blended local Argentine tobacco with fine blends, marketing them to Greeks abroad. It was a clever move. He wasn't just selling tobacco, he was selling familiarity, nostalgia in smoke form. For Greeks far from home, a cigarette became a memory of the Aegean. This ingenuity, turning displacement into opportunity, was the hallmark of Aristotle's rise. Think of a chess player who has lost half his pieces but uses the pawns left on the board to trap the opponent's queen. Onassis played with what he had, and he played brilliantly. But to frame Aristotle's beginnings as purely entrepreneurial misses the deeper truth. His ambition was personal, almost emotional. He was a man constantly proving that he would never again be powerless, never again be the refugee carrying a bundle down a crowded quay. The yachts, the mansions, the glamorous companions, all were part of a theatre, yes, but they were also armour. Each deal, each property, each ship was a brick in a fortress built against memory. There's a saying in old immigrant communities, "We left with nothing, so we had to dream bigger than everyone else." Aristotle embodied that spirit. While others sought stability, he sought empire. While others rebuilt modest lives, he constructed something that rivaled nations. His fleet of ships would one day carry a significant share of the world's oil. His fortune would buy islands and estates that once belonged only to kings. But in these early years, what stands out is not yet the empire, it's the formation of character. Imagine a diamond under pressure, coal transformed by heat, darkness, and time. Aristotle Onassis was forged in the fires of Smyrna's destruction and polished on the avenues of Buenos Aires. His hunger was not abstract, it was rooted in loss. And so, as we step into the Onassis story, we begin not with glittering ballrooms or sunlit decks, but with the ashes of a city and a young man determined never again to be at the mercy of history. From Smyrna to Argentina, from tobacco stands to whispers on telephone lines, Aristotle began the journey that would carry him into the very heart of 20th century wealth and society. The dynasty's origins remind us that luxury is often built on wounds, and that behind every marble facade lies a story of struggle, survival, and reinvention. For the Onassis family, that foundation of hunger would become both their strength and their curse, shaping the way their fortunes rose and the way they would later fracture. Fortune on the seas. When Aristotle Onassis looked out over a harbour, he didn't just see ships, he saw floating fortunes, steel kingdoms that could carry the wealth of nations. The sea had always been the backdrop of Greek life, from Homer's Odyssey to the fishing boats that dotted every coastal town. But Onassis took that heritage and turned it into a global empire. He didn't inherit fleets of vessels or centuries of shipping tradition like the old maritime dynasties of Europe. He began with scraps, bargains, and ideas that others dismissed. And yet, within a generation, he became the master of the seas. To understand his genius, we have to step into the economic moment of the early 20th century. Oil was becoming the lifeblood of modern industry. Cars, airplanes, power plants, everything needed petroleum. But oil is worthless if it cannot move. Pipelines were limited, rail transport was costly. The future lay in ocean tankers, and Aristotle Onassis was among the first to see it clearly. At first, his entry into shipping looked modest. In the late 1920s, he purchased 2 aging freighters. They weren't glamorous, they were the kind of vessels most established companies would have scrapped. Imagine walking onto a used car lot where every vehicle has rust and missing tires. Those were his first ships. But Aristotle understood something crucial. The sea doesn't care if a ship is old, only whether it floats and carries cargo. He bought them cheap, operated them lean, and turned profits where others saw only risk. During the Great Depression, when most men with money hoarded it, Onassis spent. He saw opportunity in collapse. Ships were being sold at a fraction of their value, and he acquired them aggressively. It was like a chess player sacrificing pawns to corner a king. While old shipping families hesitated, he moved boldly. This contrarian instinct, buying when others fled, became one of his lifelong strategies. But his true breakthrough came with tankers. Oil transport in the 1930s was still developing. Onassis realized that scale mattered. The bigger the tanker, the lower the cost per barrel. He began commissioning vessels larger than what was standard at the time, betting that oil demand would only increase. And he was right. By the 1940s and 1950s, his tankers dwarfed many of their competitors. Each one was a floating gold mine, earning him contracts with oil majors who wanted efficiency above all. One of his most audacious moves was registering ships under flags of convenience. At the time, shipping was bound by high taxes and strict regulations in traditional maritime nations like Britain or Greece. Onassis sidestepped this by registering his fleet in Panama and later Liberia, countries with minimal oversight. This allowed him to cut costs dramatically. Old money ship owners sneered, calling it cheap and dishonorable. But it worked, and soon, many of those same competitors quietly copied him. Onassis's cunning also extended to diplomacy. He negotiated directly with governments, often securing deals that went beyond business. In one famous instance, he struck a deal with Saudi Arabia for exclusive oil transport rights. Though later challenged by the major oil companies, it revealed his audacity. He didn't just want contracts, he wanted monopolies. He wasn't afraid to walk into palaces and negotiate with kings, using charm, persistence, and occasionally sheer nerve to win terms no one else would attempt. If you picture him at this stage, imagine a man not in boardrooms surrounded by charts, but on shipyards, leaning against hulls, smelling the salt air, watching welders at work. He loved ships, their lines, their power. But he also loved the game, outmaneuvering men who had inherited fleets, showing them that intelligence and hunger could beat pedigree. The comparison between Onassis and his rivals is striking. Many old shipping families in Britain and Northern Europe operated conservatively, relying on established networks and traditions. They were like aristocrats managing estates, solid, predictable, but slow to change. Onassis was the upstart gambler. Where they invested cautiously, he doubled down. Where they saw risk, he saw leverage. This is why his empire grew so quickly. It wasn't just money, it was mindset. World War II both threatened and enriched him. Several of his ships were lost, but demand for transport skyrocketed afterward. The rebuilding of Europe required oil, steel, grain, everything carried by sea. Onassis expanded furiously, buying surplus Liberty ships from the United States and converting them for commercial use. Again, he was faster than his competitors, scooping up vessels before others realized their value. By the 1950s, Onassis controlled one of the largest private fleets in the world. His tankers carried oil that powered cities, armies, and industries. He had turned the accidents of history, refugee displacement, Depression-era bargains, wartime chaos, into stepping stones. To put his achievement in perspective, imagine today an immigrant arriving in a foreign city with little money, buying a handful of failing startups that no one else wants, and within 20 years, building a company that dominates global tech. That's what Onassis did, only with steel, fuel, and oceans, but his shipping empire was more than business. It was theater. The sight of his colossal tankers in port was a statement, a visual reminder of his dominance. They were castles on water, symbols of his power in an age when oil shaped geopolitics. Nations depended on the very vessels he commanded. His ships didn't just move cargo, they moved history. This mastery of the seas gave him both fortune and fame, and it laid the foundation for everything else, the mansions, the yachts, the affairs that captivated tabloids. Without the tankers, there would be no Scorpios, no marriage to Jackie Kennedy, no family saga writ large across the 20th century. The ocean, with its risks and riches, was the canvas on which he painted his empire. And so, from scraps and steel, Aristotle Onassis charted his path into legend, proving that hunger and vision could outmatch pedigree and tradition. His ships became his fortune, his reputation, and his weapon. They were not just vessels of commerce, but vessels of ambition, carrying him ever closer to the center of global power. The world discovers Onassis. In Buenos Aires during the 1920s, the cafes hummed with voices. Waiters in crisp white jackets served coffee strong enough to sharpen conversation, while cigarette smoke curled in the air like ribbons. At one of those cafe tables often sat a young Greek immigrant who carried himself as if he already belonged among the city's elite. Aristotle Onassis had little in his pockets, but he had something more valuable: presence. He spoke with charisma, dressed carefully even when he could not afford the finest fabrics, and leaned forward into conversations with a curiosity that made powerful men take notice. In a city filled with ambitious newcomers, he stood out not for his wealth, he had almost none, but for his confidence, almost audacious in its scale. Buenos Aires was his stage, and he understood performance. He cultivated friendships with diplomats, journalists, and businessmen by sheer force of charm. If he couldn't pay the bill, he made sure his wit or his stories compensated. Imagine a man who could make even a borrowed suit look like it was tailored in Paris. That was Onassis. It was not yet fortune, but it was the beginning of spectacle. As his cigarette business took off, he began to upgrade his lifestyle in small but noticeable ways. A better suit here, a gold watch there. People began to whisper his name. He wasn't just a merchant, he was a character, someone worth knowing. This was the moment when Onassis began to master not just commerce, but image. For him, business was never separate from persona. Every handshake, every dinner, every gesture was an investment in his brand. By the 1930s, with his shipping ventures growing, he ventured into European circles. Monte Carlo, Paris, and later Monaco became natural magnets for a man who craved both legitimacy and glamour. There, he was no longer simply Aristotle, the ambitious Greek immigrant. He was Aristotle Onassis, the shipping magnate, the man who arrived in luxury cars and hosted gatherings where laughter and champagne flowed freely. High society at the time was both welcoming and suspicious of newcomers. Old money families of Europe had centuries of lineage behind them. They were used to wealth arriving in inheritances, not in bold leaps from tobacco stands and second-hand ships. Onassis fascinated them because he played their game but refused their rules. He was like a chess player who turned the board sideways and still declared checkmate. He wore tuxedos, but he also wore his outsider energy proudly. He was not a lord or a count, but he could outspend them and often outshine them. Monaco became a centerpiece of his rise. The tiny principality was glamorous, a playground for royals, Hollywood stars, and financiers. It was here that Onassis's love of spectacle truly blossomed. He bought into the Monte Carlo casino and struck friendships with royalty, most notably Prince Rainier. Imagine the audacity of a refugee from Smyrna, now sitting at tables with princes, discussing business and pleasure, as if he had been born into that world. This wasn't assimilation, it was conquest. One of his greatest tools was the yacht. For Onassis, the sea was not only business, but theatre. His later yacht, Christina O, would become legendary, but even before that, he used ships as floating stages for high society encounters. On a deck overlooking the Mediterranean, he blurred the lines between businessman and host, between magnate and mythmaker. People remembered not just the deals they struck with him, but the evenings they spent in his company, watching the sun set over azure waters while glasses of Dom Perignon sparkled in their hands. There was also his flair for romance. Onassis moved easily among some of the most famous women of his era, from opera diva Maria Callas to Jacqueline Kennedy. But even in the earlier days, he understood that being seen with the right companions elevated his status. These relationships weren't only personal, they were also social capital, the kind that opened doors to rooms even money sometimes could not buy. His rise into high society was not smooth or uncontested. There were whispers that he was too brash, too new, too willing to bend rules. And it was true. Onassis was never bound by convention. He cut deals that others called reckless, operated with legal loopholes others found unseemly, and always seemed to stay one step ahead of regulators. Yet, this very audacity was what made him magnetic. He lived out loud in a world that often preferred quiet wealth, and in doing so, he redefined what wealth looked like. Consider this. Old European dynasties often presented wealth in restraint. A discreet estate in the countryside, a tasteful dinner party, a family crest carved into stone. Onassis, by contrast, turned wealth into a spotlight. He wasn't just rich, he was dazzling. If old money was a portrait in muted oils, Onassis was a neon sign against the night sky. And the world noticed. Newspapers covered his business ventures but also his parties. Photographers followed him not just into boardrooms, but onto beaches, yachts, and opera houses. He understood early what many later tycoons would discover, that in the 20th century, image was as powerful as capital. To be wealthy was not enough. To be seen as wealthy, glamorous, and untouchable was the true prize. From Buenos Aires cafes to Monaco's salons, Aristotle Onassis perfected this dance. He built his empire on steel, but he gilded it with champagne, silk, and spectacle. Every setting became a stage, and every introduction an audition for his role as one of the world's most fascinating figures. The boy who had once listened in on strangers' conversations as a telephone operator now commanded the attention of kings, actresses, and magnates alike. The world did not just discover Onassis, he insisted on being discovered, crafting himself into a character who could never be ignored. And with his persona firmly established, his fortunes at sea growing, and his presence in high society undeniable, he was ready for the next act, to anchor his wealth not only in business, but in the physical monuments of power, mansions, estates, and the private islands that would soon bear his mark. Grosvenor Square, London, a stage for the elite. If Buenos Aires was Aristotle Onassis's training ground and Monaco his stage, then Grosvenor Square in London was where his world intersected most visibly with the very definition of old money society. The mansion Onassis acquired in Mayfair was more than bricks and mortar. It was a declaration. It announced that he, the refugee boy from Smyrna who once counted cigarettes to make a living, now had a seat among the aristocracy of Europe. In London's grandest district, where townhouses stood like stone fortresses for dukes, bankers, and ambassadors, the Onassis name appeared on the same roll call. For Americans, Grosvenor Square carries echoes of embassy life and World War II planning rooms. For Onassis, it carried something different: legitimacy. The townhouse was not only a family residence, it was also a salon of influence, a meeting ground where power and glamour intertwined. Here, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, already the most photographed woman in the world, received guests under chandeliers that had once glittered for lords and ladies of the British Empire. Here too, her sister Lee Radziwill floated through drawing rooms, weaving Kennedy mystique with European aristocratic grace. The house itself had all the hallmarks of Mayfair grandeur: sweeping staircases, polished parquet floors, gilt-framed mirrors, and ceilings painted with soft frescoes. Think of it as the architectural equivalent of a tuxedo, impeccable, restrained, yet capable of radiating a certain understated luxury. But when the Onassis family hosted an evening gathering, the restraint vanished. Champagne towers sparkled, musicians filled the air with jazz or chamber pieces, and the guest lists read like the society columns of the Times and Le Figaro. Jackie's presence gave Grosvenor Square its aura. Even in London, a city accustomed to royals, she was magnetic. Guests whispered about her grace, her fashion, her aura of tragedy transformed into resilience. Some came to glimpse Aristotle's fortune, but most came to see the woman who had once walked the halls of the White House. In many ways, the mansion became Jackie's European stage, a safe haven from the press of New York, but also a bridge to aristocratic circles she both admired and subtly rivaled. Lee Radziwill, Jackie's younger sister, added another layer of allure. As a princess by marriage, she carried her own connections into European nobility. The sisters together made Grosvenor Square a kind of family court, a place where Kennedys mingled with Windsors, where Greek shipping tycoons rubbed shoulders with English dukes. For guests, it was intoxicating. To walk through those doors was to step into a tableau where politics, glamour, and wealth danced together. But the house was more than glitter. For the Onassis children, Christina and Alexander, Grosvenor Square was a touchstone of stability in a life often lived on yachts, plains, and islands. Here they experienced a form of rootedness. Tutors arrived at the door. Family dinners unfolded in candle-lit dining rooms. For all its formality, the house contained the pulse of family life. Christina, who often felt overshadowed by her father's legend, later spoke of the mansion with a mix of nostalgia and melancholy. Aristotle himself used Grosvenor Square strategically. It was a hub where business overlapped with pleasure. Deals were floated over cocktails, contracts hinted at between courses of a dinner. In Britain, where tradition still carried enormous weight, the address itself was a kind of calling card. To be received in Grosvenor Square was to be acknowledged not just as wealthy, but as socially significant. Onassis knew that every invitation sent out carried a message. He was not an outsider anymore. He was hosting the insiders. The paradox of Grosvenor Square, however, was that while it gave Onassis the legitimacy of old money surroundings, he never fully belonged. Guests loved the spectacle, but whispers about his brashness, his outsider origins, and his relentless ambition never disappeared. Yet this, in a way, was his triumph. They could sneer, but they could not ignore him. His house, his guest list, his wife ensured that his name sat at the center of European society conversations. Think of Grosvenor Square as a theater. The facade was the curtain, grand, stone, dignified. Inside, the rooms were the stage, set for performances of status. The actors were Jackie, Lee, Christina, and Aristotle himself, each playing roles that fascinated an audience of aristocrats, tycoons, and socialites. The script was improvised, but the theme was always the same. Power dressed as elegance, tragedy turned into glamour, money reimagined as legitimacy. The London mansion stands as an emblem of Onassis's unique journey. From the ashes of Smyrna to the salons of Mayfair, he had climbed not just financially but socially, reshaping himself into a figure who could command attention even in the most exclusive of rooms. Grosvenor Square was not just a house. It was a mirror reflecting how far the family had come and how much farther they still intended to go. Fifth Avenue, New York, Jackie's refuge on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, just across from Central Park, stood one of the most symbolic addresses in America. Fifth Avenue has long been a corridor of aspiration, where the wealthy live not just in comfort, but in full view of the world. For Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who carried both the glamour of Camelot and the shadow of tragedy, her apartment there became more than an address. It was a sanctuary, a space where public life ended at the door and private healing began. After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, Jackie became the most famous widow in the world. Every public appearance, every word, every expression was dissected by newspapers and magazines. She needed somewhere to step back, a place where her children could grow without the constant flash of cameras, and where she could redefine herself away from the suffocating myth of Camelot. Fifth Avenue offered that refuge. The apartment was elegant, understated compared to the sprawling estates and gilded salons she often visited, but precisely for that reason, it mattered. Here, Jackie could exist without performance. The windows looked out across Central Park, where the seasons softened the city's relentless pace. In spring, she would walk under blossoming trees. In autumn, she watched the leaves drift onto quiet paths. For many New Yorkers, Central Park is just a green escape. For Jackie, it was a buffer, a gentle reminder that nature still had rhythms beyond politics, wealth, or grief. Inside, the apartment carried her personal imprint. She filled it with books, photographs, and carefully chosen art. Never excessive, always thoughtful. Friends recalled that the space felt less like a palace and more like a cultivated retreat, one that balanced sophistication with intimacy. For her children, Caroline and John Jr., the apartment became a steady anchor. In a life marked by constant travel between Hyannisport, Washington, Scorpios, and Paris, Fifth Avenue was the address that gave them a sense of normalcy. It was their mother's home, their refuge from dynastic pressure. When Jackie married Aristotle Onassis in 1968, the Fifth Avenue apartment remained central to her life. Though she traveled to Scorpios, to Paris, to the yachts and villas of the Mediterranean, she always returned here. It symbolized her American identity at a time when critics accused her of turning her back on it. The press, often harsh, framed her marriage as a betrayal of Kennedy's legacy, yet the Fifth Avenue home was proof that she had not left behind her roots. It was where she was not Mrs. Onassis the socialite, but Jackie the mother, Jackie the reader, Jackie the woman finding her own path after unbearable loss. For Aristotle, the apartment had its uses as well. It was a place to be seen when in New York, a bridge between his Mediterranean empire and American society. Yet, unlike the grand theaters of Grosvenor Square or Scorpios, the Fifth Avenue apartment belonged more to Jackie than to him. This was her territory, a space where she set the tone, where elegance was subtle and privacy was sacred. The symbolism of the address cannot be overstated. Fifth Avenue had long been synonymous with old money families, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys. By making her home there, Jackie not only embedded herself within that tradition, but also redefined it. She brought with her the aura of the White House, the lingering romance of Camelot, and the modern resilience of a woman navigating a new life. In many ways, she made Fifth Avenue her stage, but one in which the performance was quieter, more personal. Neighbors often saw her walking the streets around the building, sometimes alone, sometimes with her children. There were no grand entourages, no dramatic entrances. She blended into the city she loved, even as she remained one of its most recognizable figures. New Yorkers, famously indifferent, gave her space. Unlike the paparazzi-filled streets of Europe, here she could move with relative freedom. This urban anonymity was perhaps her greatest luxury. The apartment also represented continuity across chapters of her life. It was the place she returned to after seasons on Scorpios, after summers at Redgate Farm, after years in Washington. No matter how much the world shifted, Fifth Avenue remained. For a woman who had seen her husband assassinated in front of her, who had raised her children in the glare of international scrutiny, this constancy mattered. It was, in its own way, her anchor. For Americans, the image of Jackie on Fifth Avenue remains iconic. She was no longer the First Lady waving from motorcades, nor the widow draped in mourning veils. She was Jackie, walking with sunglasses through Central Park, holding her children's hands, living not as a symbol, but as a person. The apartment allowed her to craft this version of herself, one that balanced the demands of history with the needs of ordinary life. In the story of the Onassis family, the New York apartment stands apart. It was less about spectacle and more about survival. It was not a stage for elites, but a shield for a woman who had lived more under the spotlight than most monarchs. Fifth Avenue, with its blend of prestige and privacy, gave Jackie what she needed most, a place to breathe. Scorpios, paradise purchased. There are islands that exist in geography books, and then there are islands that live in imagination. Scorpios, a rocky outcrop off the western coast of Greece, belonged to the first category until Aristotle Onassis bought it in 1963 and transformed it into the second. What had once been an overlooked speck in the Ionian Sea became one of the most famous private islands in the world, a symbol not just of wealth, but of control, vision, and theatre. Scorpios was not merely land. It was an empire in miniature, sculpted to reflect Onassis's desires. When Onassis purchased the island, it was little more than scrubland. Sparse vegetation, rocky terrain, and no infrastructure. By most standards, a poor investment. But Aristotle saw what others could not. He imagined an Eden where barren ground could become paradise. To bring that dream into reality, he ordered thousands of trees, shipped in fertile soil from the mainland, and planted groves of olives and pines. He imported sand to create beaches where none existed. Each decision was a performance of power. He was rewriting nature itself. The scale of transformation was staggering. Engineers laid water systems, roads, and electricity. Villas rose from the island's slopes, designed with marble, terraces, and sweeping views of the sea. Gardens bloomed with exotic flowers flown in from faraway lands. It was as though Onassis wanted Scorpios to be an island that had never existed in Greece's natural order, a curated paradise as carefully crafted as a stage set. For Onassis, the island also carried a symbolic resonance. In Greek mythology, islands often served as realms of gods, heroes, and exiles. To own one was to step into that mythic tradition. Scorpios became his Olympus, his private kingdom in the Ionian, a place where he was not just a magnate, but a sovereign. Unlike Grosvenor Square or Fifth Avenue, where he entered established social orders, Scorpios was his alone, built from scratch, uncontested, absolute. The island quickly became shorthand for Onassis' power. When he hosted gatherings there, the guest lists read like a who's who of 20th century influence. Princes, presidents, prime ministers, artists, and magnates. It was here that Jackie Kennedy married Aristotle in 1968, in a ceremony that shocked and fascinated the world. Images of Jackie in her white Valentino gown against the backdrop of Scorpios' beaches circulated across front pages, cementing the island's association with spectacle. For some, it was a fairy tale. For others, a scandal. But no one doubted its significance. Scorpios had become the global stage for Onassis myth-making. Beyond weddings, the island hosted countless gatherings where champagne flowed, orchestras played, and the Mediterranean night echoed with laughter. Winston Churchill, Maria Callas, and countless Hollywood figures passed through its villas. Journalists described Scorpios as a floating court, though it was anchored in the Ionian. It functioned like a private Versailles, where invitations themselves conferred prestige. To be on Scorpios was to be inside the legend, part of the Onassis story. Yet Scorpios was not only a playground, it was also a fortress. Onassis used it as a retreat from the relentless attention of the press and the ceaseless demands of business. Here, he controlled every detail: who entered, what was seen, how the story unfolded. In a life often shaped by outside forces, from Smyrna's burning to corporate rivalries, Scorpios was his domain, the one arena where chaos could not intrude. The island carried darker notes too. Christina Onassis, Aristotle's daughter, grew up spending summers there. For her, Scorpios was both paradise and prison. While her father entertained the world's elites, she often felt isolated, trapped within the gilded environment he had created. Later in life, she would describe her childhood on Scorpios as lonely, despite the glittering company. The island, for all its beauty, carried the weight of family tension. Still, in the public imagination, Scorpios remained a wonder. It embodied the very essence of Onassis' wealth, transformation. Where others saw barren rock, he saw potential. Where others accepted limitations, he imported solutions. Scorpios was proof that his empire was not confined to ships and markets. It extended to landscapes, even to the natural order itself. The lasting irony of Scorpios is that, like many symbols of power, it outlived the man who created it. After Onassis' death in 1975, the island passed through his heirs, eventually sold and transformed again by new billionaires. Yet the name Scorpios remains inseparable from Onassis. It is a word that conjures not just a place but an era, the Gilded Age of the Mediterranean, when one man's vision turned a forgotten island into a global icon. To walk its beaches today is to walk in Aristotle's shadow. Every imported tree, every carved marble path, every artificial stretch of sand still carries the echo of his ambition. Scorpios was not just paradise purchased, it was paradise created, imposed and immortalized, an island that told the world not just what Aristotle Onassis owned, but who he was. The Christina O floating empire. If Scorpios was Aristotle Onassis's kingdom on land, then Christina O was his empire at sea. Few symbols of the 20th century wealth captured the imagination like this yacht, an extraordinary vessel that carried more history, gossip and spectacle on its decks than perhaps any other ship afloat. From its origin as a war frigate to its reincarnation as a floating palace, Christina O was more than a yacht. It was a statement, a stage, and a legend. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II. The Canadian Navy decommissioned a surplus frigate, a battered warship that had once escorted convoys through the Atlantic's deadly waters. To most, it was scrap metal, destined for rust and dismantling. To Onassis, it was raw material. He purchased the vessel for a fraction of its worth, then poured millions into transforming it into something no one had ever seen before, a yacht that rivaled royal palaces. It was, in essence, an act of alchemy, turning steel forged for war into a symbol of peace, pleasure, and extravagance. The conversion was meticulous and imaginative. Architects stripped away the frigate's utilitarian skeleton and rebuilt it with suites, salons, and decks designed for leisure rather than battle. The ship stretched over 300 feet, dwarfing most private yachts of the era. Onassis installed a grand staircase, a swimming pool that could transform into a dance floor at the touch of a button, and staterooms that rivaled five-star hotels. Fine woods, Italian marble, and chandeliers glittered where once there had been only metal bulkheads and ammunition racks. Every detail carried his imprint, audacious, theatrical, and designed to impress. But what truly set Christina O apart was not only its design, but its role as a gathering place. Onassis used it as a floating salon where politics, art, and glamour mingled. Imagine the guest list: Winston Churchill sipping whiskey in the wood-paneled library, Maria Callas singing informally in the dining room, Marilyn Monroe leaning on the railings under a Mediterranean sunset. Hollywood stars, heads of state, royalty, all came aboard. For them, the yacht was more than a venue. It was a passport into Onassis's world, where deals were whispered as easily as jokes, and where the atmosphere blurred the line between diplomacy and decadence. Onassis understood that the yacht was not just a luxury, but a stage for power. Hosting Churchill, for example, gave him credibility in political circles. Entertaining movie stars gave him currency in the world of glamour. Every guest who stepped aboard lent him a piece of their reputation, and in turn they borrowed from his aura of boundless wealth. In this way, Christina O functioned like an engine, constantly generating prestige. And yet, the yacht was also deeply personal. Named after his daughter Christina, it was meant to root his legend in family as well as fortune. For Christina herself, the yacht was both pride and burden. She grew up in its suites, but also in its shadow, as her father's obsession with spectacle often left her adrift emotionally. For Aristotle, though, the yacht represented permanence. Fleets of tankers earned him billions, but they were industrial, anonymous. Christina O carried his personality across oceans. Perhaps the most famous feature of the yacht was its swimming pool. Surrounded by mosaic tiles depicting the myth of the Minotaur, the floor could rise to create a dance platform, transforming an afternoon swim into an evening gala. It was a perfect metaphor for Onassis himself. Practical ingenuity fused with theatrical flair. To step into that pool was to step into his vision of what wealth should feel like. Fluid, surprising, larger than life. The Christina O also carried an aura of secrecy. Deals were made in its private salons, affairs were whispered about in its cabins, and gossip flowed as freely as champagne. Guests who boarded often left with stories they couldn't tell in public, only in hushed tones later. It was not just luxury, it was mystery. And mystery always multiplies legend. For the press, the yacht became shorthand for Onassis excess. Photographs of Jackie Kennedy Onassis sunbathing on its deck circulated worldwide, fusing American Camelot with Mediterranean opulence. To critics, it was vulgar, an immigrant's overcompensation. To admirers, it was brilliance, proof that ambition could rewrite destiny. Either way, Christina O commanded attention. Even after Onassis's death, the yacht remained iconic. Passed through airs, sold, restored, and relaunched, it continues to sail today as one of the most storied vessels in the world. No longer the exclusive preserve of Aristotle's Circle, it now hosts charters for those willing to pay the staggering price of touching history. But its decks still echo with the memory of cigars smoked by Churchill, songs sung by Callas, and footsteps of Jackie in her oversized sunglasses. To call Christina O a yacht is to undersell it. It was a floating empire, carrying not just passengers, but narratives, dreams, and symbols. It embodied everything that made Onassis unforgettable. The transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary, the blurring of business and pleasure, the obsession with being not just rich but remarkable. In steel and teak, in marble and mosaic, Christina O told the world who Aristotle Onassis was, not just a magnate, but a man who made the sea itself his stage. Jackie and Aristotle, a marriage of icons. Few marriages in the 20th century generated as much fascination, scandal, and endless speculation as that of Jacqueline Kennedy and Aristotle Onassis. It was a union that seemed at once inevitable and impossible. America's most elegant First Lady, whose husband's death had turned her into a global symbol of grief, and the world's most notorious shipping tycoon, whose reputation was as dazzling as it was controversial. Together, they formed a pairing that blurred the lines between romance and transaction, between private longing and public theater. When Jackie Kennedy married Onassis in 1968, the world gasped. For many Americans, she was the eternal widow of John F. Kennedy, forever cloaked in black veils and eternal devotion to Camelot. To see her aboard a yacht in the Aegean, wearing a Valentino gown and pledging herself to a man 2 decades older, was nothing short of shocking. Newspapers called it a betrayal. Columnists accused her of selling out to money. Even members of the Kennedy family reportedly reacted with disbelief. The image of Jackie marrying Onassis felt like a rewrite of a beloved story. But for Jackie, the choice was far more complicated than the headlines suggested. Since John F. Kennedy's assassination, she had lived under constant threat and scrutiny. The murders of her husband and later Robert Kennedy deepened her fear that she and her children were targets. Onassis, with his immense wealth and his near-obsessive control of his environment, offered something few men could: safety. He had private islands, private yachts, private jets, worlds he could seal off from the chaos of politics and the menace of violence. For Jackie, marriage to Onassis was not just romance, it was refuge. For Onassis, marrying Jackie Kennedy was the ultimate symbol of arrival. He had built fleets that carried the oil of empires. He had created islands, palaces, and yachts that dazzled the world. Yet he was still, to many, the upstart outsider, Greek, immigrant, brash, sometimes vulgar in the eyes of old European families. By marrying Jackie, he fused his fortune with America's most glamorous political dynasty. It was a coup of image, one that no rival could match. She brought him legitimacy, myth, and cultural capital. He gave her protection, luxury, and distance from tragedy. Yet beneath the glittering photographs, the marriage was never smooth. Aristotle was accustomed to dominance. He had lived his life surrounded by women who admired him, who tolerated his affairs, who accepted his terms. Jackie, by contrast, was not a mistress or a socialite to be dazzled. She was a former First Lady, raised in privilege, with her own sense of independence and dignity. Their worlds collided in ways that fascinated and horrified observers. Cultural differences magnified the tension. Jackie embodied a kind of American elegance, understated, restrained, with pearls and tailored suits that spoke of subtle wealth. Aristotle radiated Mediterranean excess, cigars, laughter that filled rooms, gestures as grand as his fortune. At Scorpios, Jackie introduced the refined etiquette of Georgetown salons. Onassis surrounded her with booming businessmen, opera singers, and European royalty. They spoke different languages, not just literally, but socially. To outsiders, the contrast made them mesmerizing. To insiders, it often made them clash. And then there was Maria Callas. The Greek opera diva had been Onassis's companion for years, and their relationship was passionate, tempestuous, and public. When Onassis married Jackie, Callas was devastated. Yet Aristotle did not sever ties completely, and whispers of continued intimacy circulated relentlessly. For Jackie, who had already endured public humiliation during JFK's infidelities, this added another layer of pain. To the gossip columns, it was irresistible, the triangle of the widow, the magnate, and the diva. Still, the marriage had moments of genuine tenderness. Jackie and Aristotle shared evenings on Scorpios, where the Mediterranean air softened the sharp edges of their union. He admired her intelligence and grace. She appreciated his confidence and ability to shield her from a world that had often treated her cruelly. For their children, Caroline and John Jr., Aristotle played the role of protector, ensuring they were guarded, secure, and free from the constant presence of paparazzi. But as the years passed, cracks widened. Onassis grew frustrated with Jackie's aloofness and her insistence on independence. Jackie grew weary of his volatility and infidelities. Friends recalled dinners where silences stretched, or moments when Jackie disappeared from the island to retreat into books and letters. For all its symbolism, the marriage was less a fairy tale and more a truce. Two icons using each other to navigate a world that demanded too much from both. In hindsight, the scandal that surrounded their union says as much about society as it does about them. Jackie's marriage to Onassis forced Americans to confront the gap between myth and reality. She was not frozen in grief. She was a woman making choices, some pragmatic, some emotional, all human. Onassis, in turn, showed that wealth could buy access, prestige, even a marriage that stunned the world. But it could not erase the tensions of class, culture, and personality. What endured, however, was the fascination. Photographs of Jackie on the deck of Christina O, sunglasses hiding her eyes, Aristotle nearby with his ever-present cigar, remain etched in the cultural memory of the 20th century. Theirs was a marriage that belonged as much to history as to themselves. They were not simply husband and wife. They were symbols colliding, Camelot's widow and the world's richest man. Their union carried the weight of myth and scandal, of power and fragility. And in those years on yachts and islands, in mansions and apartments, they lived out a marriage that was less about happily ever after and more about navigating the relentless gaze of the world. Family tensions and personal tragedies. For all the yachts, the islands, and the headlines of glittering power, the Onassis dynasty was never free from shadows. If Aristotle Onassis built an empire of steel and spectacle, he also left behind a family marked by tension, loneliness, and loss. Behind the images of Jackie's sunglasses on the deck of Christina O, or Aristotle's booming laughter in a Mayfair salon, were quieter, darker realities that slowly unraveled the dream of a lasting dynasty. The story begins with Aristotle's children from his first marriage to Athena Livanos, Alexander and Christina. To the outside world, they were heirs to unimaginable wealth, gilded children who lived on yachts and private islands. But wealth often isolates as much as it comforts. Alexander and Christina grew up in a world where their father's presence loomed like a monument, admired by outsiders, feared at home, and impossible to escape. Alexander, the only son, carried the heavy burden of expectation. Aristotle imagined him taking the helm of the shipping empire, guiding tankers and investments into the future. Yet Alexander never quite fit the mold. He was sensitive, rebellious, and often resisted the path laid out for him. Friends recalled him as a young man who loved aviation more than business, who sought freedom in the skies while his father demanded discipline in boardrooms. Their relationship was strained, Aristotle demanding, Alexander resisting. Every disagreement seemed to underline the widening gulf between them. Then, in 1973, tragedy struck. At just 24 years old, Alexander died in a plane crash near Athens while piloting his own aircraft. The news shattered Aristotle. For all his power, for all his ships and estates, he was powerless against fate. Witnesses described him as a man transformed overnight. His booming confidence dimmed, his shoulders stooped. It was not merely the loss of a son, it was the collapse of a dynasty in the making. Alexander's death meant there was no natural heir to carry forward the empire Aristotle had spent his life building. The dream of legacy, the fortress he had constructed against his own childhood losses, cracked irreparably. Christina Onassis carried a different but equally heavy weight. As the daughter of one of the richest men in the world, she lived in palaces and aboard yachts, but she was also profoundly lonely. Her father's dominance often overshadowed her, and her mother's world of high society exposed her to endless scrutiny. Christina grew into a woman of striking intelligence and sharp wit, but her personal life was riddled with instability. She married 4 times, each union ending in divorce. Newspapers feasted on the stories, painting her as the troubled heiress unable to find happiness. Beneath the headlines, though, lay the struggles of a woman who had lost her brother young, her father soon after, and whose inheritance carried more curse than blessing. She once remarked that she would happily trade her fortune for a single day of real happiness. For all the tabloids' fascination with her wealth and extravagance, Christina's life was defined less by privilege than by searching for love, for stability, for peace. Family tensions often played out against the backdrop of immense public attention. Aristotle's marriage to Jackie Kennedy only amplified the strain. Christina, fiercely loyal to her father but protective of her mother's dignity, often resented Jackie's presence. She viewed the marriage as a disruption, a spotlight magnified even further on a family already living under microscopes. The dynamics were never smooth, and beneath the polite photographs taken on Scorpios lay undercurrents of mistrust and rivalry. The tragedies piled one upon another. After Alexander's death in 1973, Aristotle's health began to decline rapidly. Just 2 years later, in 1975, he himself died, leaving Christina as the principal heir. Barely 30, she inherited not only one of the largest private fortunes in the world, but also the crushing responsibility of managing an empire she had never truly wanted. For a young woman already struggling with personal demons, the inheritance was overwhelming. Christina's later years were marked by a spiral of health issues, emotional turmoil, and isolation. She moved across continents, from Paris to Buenos Aires to New York, seeking homes that never quite became havens. Despite her fortune, she confessed to friends that she felt like a prisoner of money. She had everything that others envied, yet little that she truly desired. In 1988, at just 37 years old, Christina Onassis was found dead in a bathtub in Buenos Aires. The official cause was pulmonary edema, but speculation swirled around her fragile health, her depression, and the weight of her life. Her daughter Athena, barely 3 years old, became the sole surviving heir of the Onassis fortune. Once a family envisioned as a dynasty, with generations steering fleets and commanding society, the Onassis line had narrowed to one small child. The arc of the Onassis family reads almost like a Greek tragedy, appropriate given their roots. A patriarch who rose from refugee to magnate, determined to build a fortress of wealth. A son, the chosen heir, lost in the prime of youth. A daughter, left with riches but haunted by loneliness. And finally, a dynasty reduced to one fragile thread. It is tempting to see their story only in terms of wealth and glamour. But beneath it all lies a universal truth. No fortune, however vast, shields a family from grief. In fact, sometimes the fortune amplifies it, turning private pain into public spectacle. For the Onassis family, yachts and islands could not insulate them from tragedy. They were, in the end, as vulnerable as anyone else, perhaps even more so, because the world was always watching. Horse Country Retreat, New Jersey escapes. In the rolling hills of New Jersey's Somerset County lies a pocket of America that feels a world apart from the skyscrapers of Manhattan or the marble terraces of Scorpios. Known as Horse Country, the region around Peapack Gladstone has long drawn those who love the rhythms of equestrian life. Fox hunts on autumn mornings, barns filled with polished saddles, and wide fields that seem to stretch endlessly under the sun. For Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, this landscape was more than an escape. It was a return to something elemental, a space where she could breathe, and where the horses themselves came to embody both control and freedom in her complicated life. Jackie's connection to horses had begun in her childhood, long before she was a first lady or the wife of a shipping tycoon. As a young girl growing up on Long Island, she found joy in riding, mastering the discipline of equestrian sport with remarkable skill. Photographs from her youth show her poised in the saddle, confident and composed, a girl who looked entirely at ease in motion. Riding was not simply a pastime, it was a language she understood intuitively. When she acquired the estate in Peapack Gladstone during her years with Aristotle Onassis, it was as if she was reclaiming a part of herself that the public had nearly erased. To most of the world, Jackie was the widow in a black veil, or the woman photographed on the deck of Christina O, but in New Jersey, away from cameras and gossip, she could slip into riding boots, tie back her hair, and ride across the countryside with the wind in her face. It was a reminder that she was not only a symbol, not only a wife or a widow, but also a woman who found power in physical motion, balance, and skill. The estate itself reflected this duality of elegance and simplicity. It was grand enough to befit someone of Jackie's stature, with stables, paddocks, and sweeping lawns. Yet it was not ostentatious. Unlike the ballrooms of Grosvenor Square or the terraces of Scorpios, the house in Peapack Gladstone was built for utility as much as comfort. Its true heart was the stables, where grooms tended to horses, and where Jackie could disappear into the quiet rituals of equestrian care. The brushing, the saddling, the small acts that grounded her in a tactile reality. Horses, for Jackie, carried symbolic weight. In a life where she had so often been at the mercy of events, assassinations, tragedies, public scrutiny, riding gave her a sense of control. On horseback, she directed the rhythm, the pace, the path forward. Yet riding also carried the paradox of freedom. When a horse gallops, there is surrender as well as control. You yield to the animal's power, trusting its strength even as you guide it. This balance mirrored Jackie's own struggles, the desire to shape her life against forces that often overwhelmed her, and the recognition that freedom sometimes meant letting go. The Horse Country estate also became a refuge for her children. Caroline and John Jr. spent weekends there, free to run across fields, to play without the constant gaze of city streets. For John Jr. especially, it was a taste of ordinary childhood. Muddy boots, scraped knees, laughter echoing through barns. Jackie, who had seen her children photographed and analyzed since birth, found relief in watching them blend into a community where horses, not headlines, set the agenda. Visitors to the estate often remarked on how different Jackie seemed there. In New York or Paris, she was precise, elegant, sometimes distant. In Peapack Gladstone, she laughed more freely. Her posture softened, her guard lowered. On horseback, she was not a global icon, but simply another rider among riders. Her elegance translated into athletic grace rather than couture. The equestrian world itself is steeped in tradition, discipline, and hierarchy, qualities Jackie both respected and mirrored in her own life. Yet it is also a world of escape, of fields where the noise of cities and the chatter of society cannot reach. This duality made horse country the perfect metaphor for Jackie's existence. She moved in circles of unimaginable privilege, yet sought ordinary joys. She carried the weight of history, yet longed for private freedom. Aristotle Onassis understood her love of horses, even if he did not share it. To him, the estate was another property in a vast portfolio. To Jackie, it was far more intimate, a sanctuary, a lifeline to herself. In a marriage often marked by cultural clash and personal distance, Peapack. Gladstone offered her something independent of him, something he could neither control nor define. In the broader arc of the Onassis family, the horse country retreat may seem like a footnote compared to Scorpios or Christina O. Yet it reveals something deeper about Jackie, that beyond the stage sets of wealth and power, she sought places that reminded her of who she was before the spotlight. Horses gave her rhythm when the world seemed chaotic, dignity when the world treated her as spectacle, and freedom when life often felt like a gilded cage. The fields of Peapack Gladstone still carry echoes of hoofbeats, reminders of a woman who found solace there. In those rides across the New Jersey hills, Jackie reclaimed not just motion, but meaning. And in doing so, she showed that even in the midst of dynastic drama and global attention, true refuge often lies not in mansions or yachts, but in the simple act of holding the reins and choosing, for a while, your own path. Redgate Farm, the new American estate. On the windswept shores of Martha's Vineyard lies Redgate Farm, a 340-acre property that became Jackie Kennedy Onassis's true American sanctuary. Purchased in 1979, just 4 years after the death of Aristotle Onassis, the estate was a decisive gesture, a turning of the page, a return to American soil, and a blending of two legacies, the romance of Kennedy's Camelot and the resources of the Onassis fortune. Redgate Farm was not merely another piece of real estate. It was Jackie's statement that she could, at last, create a life on her own terms. The farm itself, tucked away in Athena on the island's quieter western edge, looked nothing like the gilded salons of Grosvenor Square or the manicured perfection of Scorpios. Its beauty was raw, elemental. The Atlantic pounded against sandy dunes. Wild meadows shifted with the seasons, dotted with deer and seabirds. Old stone walls stretched across rolling fields. For Jackie, who had lived in gilded cages, whether the White House, Fifth Avenue, or Scorpios, this landscape offered freedom. She could walk for hours without being photographed, ride horses without headlines, breathe air that smelled of salt and pine rather than champagne and cigars. Yet make no mistake, this was not a retreat into rustic simplicity. Jackie poured her wealth into transforming Redgate Farm into a refined, comfortable estate. The original house was modest, but she commissioned a larger residence that balanced traditional New England shingle style with touches of understated elegance. Wide porches framed views of the sea. Rooms were filled with light, decorated in Jackie's signature style. Classic, never ostentatious, designed for living rather than impressing. Gardens bloomed with both native plants and imported favorites. a careful curation of wildness and cultivation. In many ways, Redgate Farm symbolized a synthesis of Jackie's life experiences. From the Kennedys, she carried a love of New England summers, sailing, and family gatherings by the shore. From Onassis, she inherited the means to secure such a vast, private stretch of paradise. It was Kennedy romance underwritten by Onassis' wealth, a fusion that perfectly embodied her identity in those years. For her children, Caroline and John Jr., the estate became a grounding force. They had grown up in the glare of both Kennedy tragedy and Onassis extravagance. But on Martha's Vineyard, they found something like normalcy. John Jr. surfed and played on the beach. Caroline rode horses across the meadows. Friends who visited recalled laughter echoing across the dunes, bonfires on the shore, and Jackie herself appearing more relaxed than in any other setting. In a life marked by constant performance, Redgate Farm gave her the gift of privacy. Symbolically, the estate carried enormous weight. While Jackie's years with Onassis had tethered her to Greece, yachts, and Europe's high society, Redgate Farm brought her firmly back into the American story. It anchored her in Massachusetts, not far from the Kennedy compound at Hyannis Port, reconnecting her to the family narrative that so many Americans still cherished. To own such a property on Martha's Vineyard, a place associated with both exclusivity and simplicity, was to claim a distinctly American form of aristocracy. Yet, unlike Scorpios, Redgate Farm was not built for spectacle. It was built for retreat. Whereas Onassis invited the world's elite to his island, Jackie rarely opened her Martha's Vineyard home to outsiders. It was not a stage but a shield. Even her neighbors respected the invisible boundary, treating her less as a celebrity and more as one of their own. For Jackie, this was the point. The estate allowed her to slip into anonymity, something more valuable to her than any jewel or yacht. The contrast between her two refugees, Scorpios and Redgate, are striking. Scorpios was about control over nature, importing sand, planting trees, manufacturing paradise. Redgate was about harmony with nature, dunes left wild, meadows preserved, the sea accepted in its relentless power. Scorpios was theatre, Redgate was authenticity. One was built to project power, the other to recover peace. And yet, Redgate Farm also carried an undercurrent of resilience. It was a widow's purchase, a widow's project, a widow's declaration that she would not be defined solely by loss. Here, Jackie was not the tragic First Lady or the scandalous Mrs. Onassis. She was a woman building a home, protecting her children, and cultivating a life shaped less by history and more by her own choices. Over time, Redgate Farm became inseparable from her public memory. Photographs of Jackie walking along the vineyard beaches in a sweater and jeans, far from couture, far from ceremony, captured a different side of her. This was not the woman in the blood-stained pink suit in Dallas, nor the bride in a Valentino gown on Scorpios. This was Jackie at peace, looking out over the Atlantic, private and strong. When she died in 1994, Redgate Farm stood as one of her most enduring legacies. It was the physical embodiment of her final act, not as a Kennedy widow or an Onassis wife, but as Jackie herself, independent and grounded. For the Onassis story, the estate shows how wealth, once a tool of spectacle, became in Jackie's hands a tool of retreat. For the Kennedy story, it brought her back to American shores, where her children could carry forward a legacy less about tragedy and more about continuity. In the sweep of history, Redgate Farm tells us something simple yet profound, that even those who live at the center of spectacle crave privacy, and even those who inherit dynasties crave roots. Jackie's Martha's Vineyard refuge was not just a home. It was her declaration of who she had become after everything. It was not Camelot. It was not Scorpios. It was Jackie's own. The business mind of Onassis. Aristotle. Onassis never pretended to be a gentleman merchant in the old European style. He was something different. A strategist, a gambler, and above all, a master of turning rules into tools. Where others saw constraints, he saw opportunities. Where others followed traditions, he redefined them. The steel hulls of his tankers may have been his fortune, but his true empire was built inside his mind. The relentless calculation of risks, rewards, and timing that allowed him to manipulate markets and governments alike. Onassis's business genius began with a principle many tycoons grasp but few embody: control the bottleneck. In global commerce, the bottleneck was oil. By the mid-20th century, petroleum was the oxygen of modern civilization. Armies, industries, and families alike depended on it. Yet it was useless sitting underground or in storage tanks. It had to move across oceans. Onassis saw that shipping was the critical choke point, and he placed himself directly at its center. While traditional ship owners treated oil transport as just another commodity, Onassis thought bigger. He commissioned tankers on a scale that was unprecedented, vessels that dwarfed existing ships. The logic was simple. The larger the tanker, the cheaper the cost per barrel. By undercutting competitors' rates, he could offer deals oil companies couldn't refuse. And when oil majors resisted, he went straight to the source. His 1950s deal with Saudi Arabia exemplifies his boldness. While oil transport was traditionally controlled by the Seven Sisters, the Western companies that dominated global petroleum, Onassis sidestepped them and negotiated directly with King Saud for exclusive rights to carry Saudi crude. It was an audacious move, one that infuriated established corporations and sparked legal and political battles. Although the deal ultimately collapsed under pressure, it demonstrated Onassis's willingness to challenge monopolies and rewrite rules. He had shown that even the richest corporations were vulnerable if one man had enough nerve. Equally important was his use of flags of convenience. At a time when most fleets flew national flags, binding them to strict labor laws and taxes, Onassis pioneered registering his ships in Panama and later Liberia. These countries offered looser regulations, lower taxes, and cheaper labor requirements. It was a revolutionary model, one that cut costs drastically. Critics called it dishonorable, a way of evading responsibility. Yet soon enough, many of those same critics adopted the practice themselves. Today, the vast majority of the world's merchant fleet sails under flags of convenience, a testament to Onassis's foresight. But Aristotle's business mind was not only about structural innovation, it was also about timing. During the Great Depression, when other ship owners clung to what they had, Onassis bought ships at rock-bottom prices, betting that global trade would rebound. After World War II, he repeated the strategy, scooping up surplus Liberty ships from the United States at a fraction of their replacement cost. He understood the cyclical nature of markets and treated downturns not as disasters, but as shopping seasons. Onassis also wielded charm and intimidation as business tools. He could be disarmingly persuasive, flattering a government minister one moment, then fiercely uncompromising the next. Diplomats recalled how he walked into meetings with an almost theatrical presence, tailored suits, cigar in hand, his gravelly voice carrying both warmth and menace. Deals were rarely about documents alone, they were about performance. He negotiated not just across tables, but across cultures, adapting his persona to fit each setting. With European aristocrats, he was urbane. With Middle Eastern monarchs, he was deferential but direct. With American officials, he wrapped himself in the language of free enterprise while quietly bending its spirit. Perhaps his greatest gift was the ability to see connections others missed. To Onassis, shipping was never just about ships. It was about geopolitics, psychology, and spectacle. He knew that oil companies needed reliable transport, but also that governments craved prestige and individuals craved attention. Hosting ministers on Christina O was as much a negotiation tactic as anything written into a contract. He blurred the line between leisure and leverage, making his lifestyle part of his business arsenal. And yet, for all his brilliance, His methods often invited controversy. He skirted legal boundaries, provoked rivals, and was constantly dogged by lawsuits and investigations. His battles with the US government over antitrust violations, his feud with his rival Stavros Niarchos, his disputes with oil companies, all spoke to the fact that he was never content to play safe. For Onassis, confrontation was not a hazard, but a strategy. He thrived in tension, often using it to destabilize opponents until they ceded ground. In a way, Aristotle Onassis embodied the paradox of modern capitalism. He was at once an innovator and a manipulator, a visionary and a provocateur. He created efficiencies that reshaped global trade, but he also exploited loopholes ruthlessly. He democratized practices like flags of convenience, but only after weaponizing them for his own gain. Imagine a chess player who not only anticipates his opponent's moves, but occasionally rearranges the board mid-game, daring others to adapt. That was Onassis. He played on multiple levels at once: markets, governments, public opinion, and more often than not, he won. His empire was not built on steel alone, but on audacity, on the conviction that rules could be bent, systems reimagined, and power seized by those willing to take risks others deemed unthinkable. In the boardrooms of oil companies, in the offices of ministers, in the salons of the wealthy, Aristotle Onassis proved again and again that business was not about resources alone. It was about vision, nerve, and the relentless pursuit of advantage. The tankers that crossed oceans under his command carried more than oil. They carried the weight of a mind that refused to accept limits. And through that mind, Aristotle Onassis reshaped not only shipping, but the very rules of global commerce. Rivals, friends, and enemies. To build an empire as audacious as Aristotle, Onassis's was to invite rivals at every turn. Wealth of his scale does not exist in isolation. It collides with governments, it provokes competitors, it attracts allies who are never entirely trustworthy. The Onassis story is as much about battles fought in boardrooms and salons as it is about ships and islands. For every champagne toast aboard Christina O, there was a handshake concealing a knife. The most famous of Onassis's rivals was Stavros Niarchos, a fellow Greek shipping magnate who shared not only his industry, but his ambition and taste for grandeur. If Onassis was flamboyant, Niarchos was polished. If Onassis relished spectacle, Niarchos cultivated discretion. The two men circled each other like predators, competing for contracts, ships, and sometimes even women. Niarchos married into the Livanos family, the same powerful Greek dynasty that had once tied Onassis to his first wife, Athena Livanos. Their rivalry was therefore not only economic but deeply personal, entangled in marriages, divorces, and grudges that blurred the line between family feud and business war. Both men commissioned larger and larger ships, each determined to prove himself the master of the seas. Niarchos built supertankers that rivaled Onassis's Leviathans. They outbid each other for deals, sometimes undercutting rates so low that profits were secondary to prestige. For the shipping world, their duel was legendary, a high-stakes contest that turned the Mediterranean into a chessboard. Governments, too, became both allies and adversaries. Onassis's very success depended on navigating national regulations and international treaties. His use of flags of convenience angered maritime nations who saw tax revenues slip away. His Saudi oil transport deal of the 1950s enraged the American oil majors, who lobbied Washington to block him. At times, he seemed less a businessman than a shadow statesman, negotiating with kings and presidents in ways that blurred sovereignty. The United States government, in particular, had a complicated relationship with Onassis. On one hand, his fleet supported the movement of oil crucial to Western economies. On the other, his attempts to bypass corporate monopolies threatened powerful interests. Investigations, lawsuits, and whispered accusations followed him throughout his career. He was both indispensable and suspect. tolerated yet never fully embraced. Yet Onassis had a gift for cultivating friendships with the very people who might oppose him. Politicians, aristocrats, and royals all found their way onto Christina O, or into the villas of Scorpios. Winston Churchill, who could have dismissed him as a nouveau riche interloper, instead enjoyed Onassis's hospitality, cigars, and whiskey. For Onassis, entertaining was not idle pleasure. It was diplomacy by other means. To drink on his yacht, to bask in his hospitality, was to become part of his network, even if only temporarily. Royalty, too, drifted into his orbit. He hosted princes and kings, always balancing deference with his characteristic boldness. Some accepted him as a necessary fixture of post-war high society, while others looked down on him as a parvenu. But none could ignore him. His parties, his deals, his very presence demanded recognition. He was the outsider who refused to stay outside. At the same time, his relationships often carried an edge of unease. Maria Callas, his longtime lover, introduced him to circles of European cultural elites, yet even there he was, sometimes treated as an intruder. Jackie Kennedy, when she became his wife, brought him into the Kennedy dynasty, but whispers never ceased that it was a marriage of transaction more than love. Even his closest companions often harbored suspicion. The truth is that Onassis thrived in conflict. Rivals like Niarchos sharpened him. Government clashes tested him. Uneasy friendships elevated him. He seemed to draw energy from navigating opposition, as if the constant need to outmaneuver others confirmed his place at the table. Consider him like a sailor steering through a storm. The waves batter, the wind howls, yet the danger itself sharpens the senses, forcing precision and daring. Onassis lived in perpetual storms, and he would not have had it otherwise. To be surrounded by rivals, friends who might betray, and enemies who might negotiate was the natural environment of a man who built his fortune by rewriting rules. In the end, his empire was not defined only by steel tankers or marble villas, but by the complex web of relationships that sustained and challenged him. Without Niarchos, his victories would have seemed smaller. Without government clashes, his ingenuity would have been less striking. Without uneasy friendships with politicians and royals, his image would have been diminished. Onassis lived at the crossroads of admiration and suspicion, and it was in that tension that he thrived. Scandal and the press. To understand the Onassis family, one must also understand the relentless glare under which they lived. Wealth on its own attracts attention, but the combination of fortune, power, and glamour that surrounded Aristotle Onassis and his circle was irresistible to the press. In the second half of the 20th century, an age when gossip columns and paparazzi grew into industries of their own, the Onassis family became both muse and prey. Newspapers and magazines built them into legends, then feasted on their scandals. Every yacht trip, every romance, every tragedy was refracted through a lens that turned private lives into public theatre. Aristotle himself courted attention as much as he suffered from it. He knew that to host Winston Churchill on the deck of Christina O was to generate headlines, and that those headlines reinforced his stature. For a man who had risen from refugee status in Smyrna to one of the richest men alive, every photograph with a head of state or movie star was not only vanity, but strategy. He turned spectacle into capital. To appear in Paris Match or the New York Times Society pages was to broadcast his legitimacy, his inclusion in a world that once might have dismissed him as an outsider. But the press is a double-edged sword, and Onassis's family learned this brutally. His long affair with Maria Callas, the famed opera singer, was reported with breathless fascination. Their passionate quarrels, reconciliations, and eventual heartbreak filled gossip columns across Europe. When Onassis abruptly married Jacqueline Kennedy in 1968, the media storm was immediate and unforgiving. Headlines screamed betrayal of Callas, of Kennedy's memory, even of propriety itself. Jackie, once revered as the grieving widow of. Camelot was now depicted as a woman who had sold out to money. For years afterward, tabloids trailed her relentlessly, photographing her every move, dissecting her wardrobe, speculating on her marriage. The paparazzi phenomenon reached fever pitch in the 1960s and 70s, and Jackie Onassis was one of its most hunted targets. Her oversized sunglasses became iconic not only for their elegance, but for their practical purpose, a shield against flashing cameras. On the streets of New York, on the beaches of Scorpios, even in the quiet lanes of Martha's Vineyard, photographers lay in wait. Her lawsuits against aggressive paparazzi in the 1970s helped spark broader conversations about privacy rights, proof that her personal struggle became a societal issue. For Christina Onassis, the glare was even crueler. Newspapers branded her the unhappy heiress, a woman adrift despite her billions. Every failed marriage, every bout of ill health, every weight fluctuation became fodder for headlines. What for anyone else would have been private struggles were transformed into public spectacle. The narrative of Christina's loneliness was exaggerated, sometimes distorted, but it had a devastating effect. She once confided to friends that she felt she had no identity apart from the stories written about her. In this sense, her life illustrates the darker side of wealth. Not just isolation, but the impossibility of privacy. The press also played a central role in amplifying the family's tragedies. Alexander Onassis's death in a plane crash was reported worldwide within hours, often with sensationalist speculation. Aristotle's collapse after the loss of his son was described in detail, every weakness of the once mighty magnate captured in words and photographs. Even in grief, the Onassis family could not escape the gaze of the world. High society magazines, meanwhile, contributed to the myth-making. Glossy spreads showed Jackie and Aristotle on Scorpios, cocktails in hand, surrounded by princes, actors, and magnates. These images reinforced the allure of the Onassis empire as a world of perfection, beauty, and limitless wealth. Yet those very same publications were quick to pivot to scandal when cracks appeared. In this way, the press constructed the family's public image as a cycle: build them up, tear them down, repeat. To the public, the Onassis saga was intoxicating because it fused fairy tale luxury with soap opera drama. It was as if ancient Greek tragedy had been rewritten for modern tabloids. A self-made titan, a glamorous widow, a betrayed diva, an unhappy heiress, a son lost too young. Each headline added a new act to the play, until the family seemed less like individuals and more like archetypes. And yet, it would be a mistake to see them only as victims of the press. Aristotle Onassis himself understood the value of myth. He cultivated it, even when it stung. He once quipped that being talked about, whether praised or vilified, was better than being ignored. Jackie too used the press when it suited her, carefully curating her image as both style icon and protective mother. The Onassis family lived in a constant negotiation with the media, sometimes wielding it, sometimes wounded by it, but never free from it. In hindsight, their story offers a window into how wealth and fame intersected with the emerging culture of celebrity. The Onassis family was not merely reported on, they were consumed. Every photograph, every article became part of a mythology that persists even today. In that sense, scandal and press coverage were not just nuisances. They were central to the making and unmaking of the Onassis legend. Legacy in architecture and art. For a man whose life was defined by movement, tankers cutting across oceans, jets flying between continents, yachts anchored in Mediterranean coves, Aristotle Onassis also left behind a world of permanence. His estates, his interiors, his taste in art and architecture formed a legacy as tangible as steel hulls or financial empires. To walk through a house once owned by Onassis, or to step aboard the Christina O, is to enter a curated space that reflected not just wealth, but ambition, vision, and a relentless pursuit of spectacle. Unlike many old money dynasties that inherited collections and manor houses layered with centuries of taste, Onassis was a man of self-invention. He did not inherit palaces, he built them. He did not grow up surrounded by Renaissance masters or Rococo furnishings. He acquired them later with deliberate intent. His aesthetic was not about tradition alone, but about projection. How an environment could amplify the myth of Aristotle Onassis, the immigrant-turned-titan. Scorpios, his private island, remains perhaps the most audacious example. When Onassis bought it in the 1960s, it was little more than scrubland, dry and sparse. He reshaped it with almost artistic obsession, importing sand to create beaches, transplanting thousands of trees to cloak its hillsides, and building villas that blended understated modernity with Mediterranean flair. The island itself became a work of art, a living canvas transformed by wealth into paradise. Its interiors carried a mix of opulent European furnishings and carefully chosen artworks that signaled both cultural refinement and financial might. Hosting royalty and celebrities, there was as much about the visual impact as the hospitality. The polished marble floors, the chandeliers, the curated landscapes that said, without words, "This is a kingdom." The Christina O likewise doubled as both transportation and gallery. The famous mosaic pool, with its mythological motif of the Minotaur, was itself a work of art. Inside, Onassis selected paneling, paintings and sculptures that created a sense of timeless elegance. Guests were not simply entertained, they were immersed in an environment that combined classical references with modern luxury. It was a floating museum of taste, each piece chosen to elevate leisure into ritual. Onassis's London residence on Grosvenor Square also testified to his ambition. In a neighborhood that had long been synonymous with aristocratic power, his mansion stood out for its blend of grandeur and intimacy. Its salons hosted Jackie Kennedy, Lee Radziwill, and Europe's upper crust, framed by interiors that balanced old-world refinement with the subtle flash of new money audacity. His eye was eclectic, drawing from French antiques, British portraiture, and Mediterranean accents, a tapestry of styles that mirrored his life across continents. Even Jackie Kennedy Onassis, with her own refined aesthetic, left her imprint on the family's architectural legacy. Her Fifth Avenue apartment in New York was chic and serene, more understated than Onassis's Mediterranean villas, but no less deliberate. Where Aristotle sought to dazzle, Jackie sought to soothe. Her interiors leaned toward light-filled spaces, muted palettes, and furnishings that invited conversation rather than awe. In Redgate Farm on Martha's Vineyard, her influence reached its fullest expression. The house she designed there reflected New England traditions, with cedar shingles, sweeping porches, and interiors filled with books, art, and objects collected from her travels. If Scorpios was a monument to Onassis's ambition, Redgate Farm was a monument to Jackie's resilience. The family's art collections were similarly diverse. Aristotle was never a connoisseur in the traditional sense, but he understood art's power to confer legitimacy. He acquired works by European masters, tapestries, and decorative pieces that filled his estates with cultural weight. Jackie, on the other hand, brought a cultivated sensibility shaped by her background in art and literature. She was drawn to modern works, to understated elegance, to pieces that suggested intellect as much as wealth. Together, their tastes created an eclectic but enduring legacy, the clash of showmanship and refinement, extravagance and subtlety. What remains striking about the Onassis architectural and artistic legacy is its durability. Decades after their deaths, the estates they built and the interiors they shaped still command fascination. Scorpios, now sold and redeveloped, continues to symbolize private luxury on a scale few can imagine. Christina O, restored and sailing once more, is chartered by the wealthy who wish to touch history. Redgate Farm, preserved by the Kennedy family, stands as a quintessential American estate, blending wilderness with cultivated design. Even Jackie's New York apartment remains an icon of Fifth Avenue refinement. These places endure because they were never merely homes. They were stages, each with its own narrative. Scorpios was the kingdom of a magnate. Grosvenor Square was the salon of a cosmopolitan striver. Fifth Avenue was the sanctuary of a woman caught between dynasties. Redgate Farm was the refuge of a survivor. And the Christina O was the floating palace where power, glamour, and myth collided. In architecture and art, the Onassis legacy is not simply about wealth displayed. It is about wealth translated into story. Each estate, each artwork, each interior told the world something about its owners, their aspirations, their contradictions, their need to be seen, and their longing to retreat. Like brushstrokes on a vast canvas, the houses, islands, and collections together form a portrait not of objects but of lives. Lives lived in the uneasy balance between spectacle and solitude. Through these lasting structures and curated interiors, Aristotle Onassis and Jackie Kennedy Onassis ensured that their myth outlived them. The steel of the tankers may rust, the markets may change, but the estates and the art remain, silent witnesses to ambition, resilience, and the enduring desire to shape the world not only with fortunes, but with spaces that embody them. Christina Onassis, Heiress in the Spotlight. Christina Onassis entered the world already burdened with a surname that carried weight like an anchor. To outsiders, she was the ultimate heiress, daughter of Aristotle Onassis, raised on yachts, in penthouses, and on private islands. Her life unfolded before the cameras of the international press, who delighted in documenting every turn of her story, from birthday parties with gilded cakes to failed marriages splashed across gossip columns. But behind the photographs and headlines lay a woman perpetually negotiating with her father's shadow, wealth's suffocating grip, and her own search for meaning. From childhood, Christina was surrounded by symbols of excess. She played in the salons of Grosvenor Square, rode bicycles along the beaches of Scorpios, and attended dinners where the guests were royals, movie stars, or heads of state. Her toys were gilded, her tutors hand-picked, her surroundings curated. Yet this environment came with its own prison bars. Aristotle Onassis was a man obsessed with control, and his daughter's upbringing was carefully managed. Friends described Christina as bright, witty, and sharp-tongued, traits that occasionally clashed with her father's commanding presence. She learned early that she was not just a child, but a future symbol of his dynasty. The death of her brother Alexander in 1973 shifted this burden onto her shoulders entirely. Aristotle, devastated and declining in health, looked increasingly to Christina as the keeper of the empire. Yet Christina never shared his appetite for business. She managed the fortune with competence, but it was responsibility rather than passion. "I was born with a silver spoon," she once remarked, "but sometimes I wish it had been plastic." That quip captured her paradox. She possessed everything material, yet little that felt freely chosen. Her adult life became a carousel of marriages and divorces, each more public than the last. She married 4 times, and each union ended in heartbreak. Her first marriage, to the American investment banker Joseph Bolker, was short-lived, annulled after only months. Later unions, with Sergei Kauzov, a Soviet shipping executive, Thierry Roussel, a French businessman, and others, collapsed under the weight of incompatible expectations and relentless media scrutiny. For the tabloids, these stories were irresistible. The unhappy heiress, doomed to repeat her father's pattern of using relationships as alliances rather than love. But to Christina, each failure deepened her loneliness. She longed for stability, for a partner who could see past the billions and the headlines. Instead, she found herself trapped in a cycle of suspicion, unsure whether men loved her or her fortune. Her daughter, Athena, born from her marriage to Thierry Roussel, became the one true anchor in her life. Christina devoted herself to motherhood, hoping to give Athena a sense of grounding that she herself had never known. The press, however, rarely gave her peace. Christina's fluctuating weight became a cruel obsession for tabloids. Headlines described her yo-yo figure with the same intensity they once reserved for her father's shipping deals. Her health struggles, thyroid issues, depression, exhaustion, were public property. Where Aristotle had thrived on spectacle, Christina was suffocated by it. Yet she was not without resilience. Despite personal turmoil, Christina managed one of the world's largest private fortunes. She oversaw Onassis holdings in shipping, real estate, and aviation. She made decisions about the family's philanthropic foundations, ensuring that Aristotle's legacy lived on in cultural and medical institutions. If she lacked her father's fire for empire building, she nevertheless proved capable of stewardship. Behind her laughter at society parties and her weary expressions in paparazzi photos was a woman who carried enormous responsibility. What makes Christina's story so poignant is that it embodies the paradox of inherited wealth. She had resources that could buy islands, yet she could not buy freedom from loneliness. She had access to every luxury, yet was denied privacy. She was the sole surviving child of a man who had conquered markets and monarchs, yet she remained a figure of fragility. Her life reads less like a fairy tale than a modern Greek tragedy, complete with the chorus of newspapers chronicling her every misstep. In November 1988, Christina Onassis was found dead in the bathroom of a friend's house in Buenos Aires. She was only 37. The official cause was pulmonary edema, but speculation swirled around exhaustion, medication, and the long toll of stress and unhappiness. Her daughter Athena, just 3 years old, became the sole heir to the Onassis fortune. For the world, the image was haunting. The vast empire of Aristotle Onassis reduced to one small child. Christina's legacy is not her failed marriages or her tabloid headlines, though those remain part of the record. It is the reminder that wealth can magnify rather than erase human struggles. Her story resonates because it strips away the illusion of money as cure-all. In her loneliness, in her longing for ordinary joys, Christina was profoundly human. She lived under the impossible weight of being both daughter and heiress, shadow and spotlight. And though her father built palaces of marble and steel, Christina's life shows us the fragility inside the fortress. For all the yachts and islands, she remained a woman searching, always searching, for love, stability, and a life she could call her own. The next generation. Athena Onassis. By the late 20th century, the sprawling Onassis dynasty had dwindled to a single figure, Athena Onassis, the granddaughter of Aristotle, the only child of Christina, and the reluctant heiress to a fortune that once symbolized both triumph and tragedy. From the moment she was born in 1985, Athena carried a dual identity. On one hand, a little girl with a ponytail and a fondness for horses. On the other, the last Onassis, bearer of a name so heavy with history that it seemed less inheritance than curse. Her early years were marked by shadows she could not yet understand. Her mother Christina, already struggling with loneliness and the weight of her inheritance, poured her energy into Athena. Friends recall that Christina adored her daughter with a fierce protectiveness, determined to give her what she herself had never had: stability and unconditional love. Yet even this devotion was brief. In 1988, when Athena was only 3, Christina died unexpectedly in Buenos Aires. Overnight, Athena became the sole heir to an empire built on tankers, islands, and myth. Her father, Thierry Roussel, a French businessman, assumed responsibility for her upbringing, along with a Swiss trust that managed her fortune. This arrangement placed Athena, in a world far from Scorpios or New York, quiet Swiss schools, discreet equestrian stables, and a family environment defined less by glamour than by secrecy. To the tabloids, she was a mystery. Headlines dubbed her the world's richest little girl, yet photographs of her were rare and interviews non-existent. The contrast with her grandfather's love of spectacle could not have been sharper. If Aristotle Onassis had made the sea his stage, Athena found her sanctuary on horseback. Like her grandmother Jackie, she cultivated a passion for riding that went beyond leisure. Horses became her escape, her rhythm, her anchor. Unlike Christina, who often seemed crushed by her inheritance, Athena channeled her energy into the structured, disciplined world of competitive equestrian sport. By her teens, she was competing internationally, showing not just skill, but an almost ascetic devotion to training. Riding offered her what wealth never could, a space where effort, practice, and courage mattered more than last names. The equestrian circuit also gave her something resembling a community. In show-jumping arenas from Europe to the Americas, Athena was not primarily an heiress, but a competitor. Other riders respected her dedication, noting that she trained hard, fell, got back up, and endured the grueling demands of the sport. For a young woman raised under the suffocating myth of the Onassis dynasty, this was liberation. Horses, unlike people, did not care about dynastic burdens. Still, the shadow of her family name followed her. Journalists continued to speculate about her fortune, which by some estimates reached billions, though it was locked up in trusts and complicated legal structures. Gossip about her inheritance often overshadowed her achievements in sport. She became the subject of endless fascination. Would she sell Scorpios? Would she revive the shipping empire? Would she step into the public role her grandfather once dominated? More often than not, her answer was silence. Athena's personal life, too, drew attention. In 2005, she married Álvaro de Miranda Neto, a Brazilian Olympic show jumper. Their wedding, held in São Paulo, attracted enormous press coverage, feeding the narrative of the heiress seeking love and normalcy. Yet, like her mother's marriages, Athena's union was troubled. Reports of infidelity and legal disputes followed, and in 2016 the couple divorced. The echoes of Christina's struggles seem to repeat themselves, a reminder that wealth did not exempt Athena from heartbreak. And then there is Scorpios. The island that Aristotle Onassis transformed into his paradise became, for Athena, a symbol of burden more than joy. Though she inherited it, she rarely visited. In 2013, she sold the island to a Russian billionaire, Dmitry Rybolovlev, ending the Onassis family's physical claim to the property that had once epitomized their myth. For some, it was a betrayal of legacy. For others, it was a pragmatic release. Athena herself gave no dramatic explanation, consistent with her lifelong pattern of silence. The narrative of Athena Onassis forces us to confront the peculiar cruelty of inheritance. To the world, she is the final chapter of a dynasty, a young woman destined to carry the name forward. But for Athena, that name has often been a burden, a weight that turned her into a symbol before she had a chance to define herself. In the riding arenas, she sought to write her own story. Yet outside of them, she remained entangled in the myth her grandfather created. Today, Athena lives largely out of the spotlight. She competes quietly, manages her affairs discreetly, and rarely grants interviews. Her life stands in stark contrast to Aristotle's theatrical displays or Christina's tragic visibility. If Aristotle embodied ambition and Christina embodied fragility, Athena embodies withdrawal, the desire to exist beyond the myth. And yet, even in her retreat, she fascinates. Perhaps because she represents the unresolved question of the Onassis saga. What happens when a dynasty narrows to a single heir? Can one young woman transform the burden into a blessing? Or does the myth consume her, as it did her mother? The story of Athena Onassis remains unfinished. She is the heiress who turned her back on the empire, the horsewoman who sought freedom in gallops and jumps rather than in gilded salons. In her quiet defiance, she has carved out a different kind of legacy, not spectacle, not empire, but survival. For the last Onassis, perhaps that is the truest inheritance of all.